Canada in 2024. Are we a confident, resilient nation, or are we a fearful, fractured country? That is the question that we'll be talking today with our friend Lieutenant Colonel David Redman.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
So with me here today is our friend and senior fellow at Frontier, Lieutenant Colonel David Redman. We're delighted to have you back, David. You've served a long career both in the military, but also serving in emergency management and planning with various levels of government. So a warm welcome to you, David.
Thank you very much, David. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Well, David, it's great to have you on to talk about really kind of the foundation of our country. You've worked with Frontier to issue a paper just recently on this very topic. And I thought it was a very interesting paper. I encourage people to look at it on the Frontier website because you really reflect on Canada in 1967 versus 2024. And I want to read kind of initially a little bit about the paper to kind of set the tone for what we're going to talk about. And that is, Canadian teenagers are told not to be proud of their country, which seems strange as many people of the world still want desperately to become Canadian. The current government relishes apologizing for actions from long ago by people in completely different circumstances and in much different international contexts. Universities seem entranced by an agenda that destroys democratic values, rights, and freedoms. And diaspora march routinely on the streets of our cities, supporting illegal terrorist organizations and demanding the death of both citizens here and abroad. Our police and courts take no action or, in fact, support these illegal acts. And teenagers rightly question who will be next to be called out, shamed, or attacked. Our current federal government, many of our provincial territorial governments, and some of our municipal governments stand silently by or in some cases support the destruction of our values, laws, and national interests. Confidence has been turned into fear and shame, and Canada has become irrelevant on the world stage. The ultimate question, therefore, is, what do Canadians want Canada to be? Why did you frame that as the question, David?
Because I've watched over the past half century, I was one of those teenagers in 1967 that celebrated the centenary of Canada. And the mood and the feeling in our country was one of unified pride, of a vibrant democracy, of a country that was internationally respected and called on by our allies and our friends to partake in many actions. And we had a strong and vibrant economy. And in 50 years, we seem to have transformed completely. And so I had to ask myself, how do we go back or at least reinstate a Canada where the citizens are proud of their country, proud of a vision for the future, a 25-year vision out of the future that will see Canada grow, strengthen, and become once again a full player on the international stage while taking care of Canadians at home.
Well, it seems like you're saying that we need to be unified as a nation with similar values and with a similar vision of our country. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I go back to what is my basic definition of what is a nation. And a nation is when a group of people who share common ethics and values band together and live within a region with defined borders. And by defined borders, I mean borders that are internationally recognized, but which the people of that culture are prepared to defend and to hold as their area of the world. And a nation who doesn't have a unifying culture and who doesn't have defined borders is not simply a nation. So yes, I strongly believe that we need to look at the defining values and ethics which define our citizens and which our citizens define for themselves, and then the
Okay.
country of Canada in a way that we're prepared to defend.
Okay. Well, it's interesting you mentioned 1967. I think for a lot of Canadians, they look to that time as fondly when Canada celebrated its centennial year. So if we could just bring up that reference to 1967, maybe, David, you could help us reflect a little bit about why you look to 1967.
Well, if you were a teenager in that year, you watched as Canada celebrated. And it was very clear we were unified. There was a military tattoo, went from coast to coast, and performed in every city. Canadians thronged to watch it. They were proud of their military, but more so they were proud of the history that was depicted in front of them in that tattoo. The tattoo wasn't just about the military. In fact, that was just a small piece of it. What it did is it gave a mosaic of our history and all of the things that had step by step through 100 years with strengths and weaknesses, but which had built a country which stood before the world. And when I say pride in our history, Canada had punched above its weight in World War I, way above its weight in World War II, and then again in Korea, where we were the third largest nation trying to withhold a country for democracy. So we were rightly proud of our history, and the world looked on us that way. We had a vibrant democracy where elections were never questioned, where the transfer and orderly transfer of government occurred every time, and where Canadians were really proud of our election system and the people we elected. We were internationally respected and were called on and built the whole concept of peacekeeping worldwide. And there are definite pros and cons to the peacekeeping, but in both Article 6 and Article 5 peacekeeping mandates, Canada was the first and always the largest to go in and try and establish order in a world. And we did it not to try and do nation changing in other countries, but to try and ensure world stability and a world where people's human rights could be respected. We did that because we had a very strong economy and were able to power project in terms of helping others, both in terms of humanitarian aid and in terms of peacekeeping. But at the end of the day, the world looked on Canada in 1967 and said, the next century belongs to Canada. And that was people from all over the world. And Canadians themselves had that faith that going forward, the next 25, the next 50, the next 100 years, Canada was going to become stronger, better, and more equipped to be a player on the global stage while taking strong care of the people that live within our country.
Indeed. So 1967 is certainly, not to romanticize it, was a fine year where Canada came together, and the kind of graphs there kind of illustrate those powerful points of unity. It's often been said by the good book that a house divided will not stand. So if you look at Canada in 2024, how would you describe that in contrast to 1967 in your mind?
Canada in 2024 is a fractured country, in my opinion. We've seen many, many pieces to try to be used to divide our Canadians into smaller and smaller groups, both by culture and by cultural issues and by social issues. And so there seems to be a step-by-step progress to break our unified country into smaller and smaller groups and to pit them against each other. So our unity seems to be, in my opinion, broken. We have been taught to be ashamed of our history. We are constantly apologizing for actions which occurred in the past, and some of the actions misrepresented, but even if they were totally represented as challenges in our past, you learn from mistakes in the past. You don't destroy your history. And you take those incidents and those activities and you come forward with a 25-year vision to make sure you won't do them again and that you can build a stronger country based on the actions of your past, not by destroying your past.
Okay.
We've seen our democratic institutions shattered. And by democratic institutions, I mean everything from elections. We're now seeing open conversations about other countries' influence in our past elections, in the past 3 elections. We see our legislatures in chaos, in my opinion, in many of the provinces and territories, and certainly in our federal order of government, where we see it's more important to go after individuals rather than to present coherent policy. We've seen our policing challenged and the use of the Emergencies Act, where policing, in my opinion, just simply didn't do their job, causing an totally inappropriate use of the Emergencies Act, which in fact the courts have stated was an inappropriate use. We've seen courts supporting the breakup of our unity rather than supporting actions to draw our unity together. Our schools, the education system, are more interested in fracture issues than they are in telling the history of our country and how our country will excel in the future and to make it excel. We've seen our media become extremely partisan. And we've also seen our medical system in tatters as we came through the COVID incident. So all of our institutions, our democratic institutions, those very things that hold the country together, elections, legislatures, police, courts, schools, medical, media, all seem to be in disarray. So much so that we're shunned now and ignored by our allies. We have no role on the international stage. Canada isn't just ignored, it's shunned, because we are now a threat to other countries' national interests because we are the weakest link, with a broken economy as well that now is in free fall. And if we look at the investment in our country, if we look at the number of bankruptcies, if we look at the cost of living, inflation, housing, the total lack of investment, both emotionally and with dollars in our country, we seem to be a fractured country, in my opinion.
Wow. So when you reference those things, it's really a powerful summary, David, in terms of the decline of our nation. For instance, I think of just this last month, I believe it was announced that some $48.6 billion had left the country in terms of business investment. That does not bode well for building a prosperous country for our kids. But when you referenced earlier that somehow our allies are shunning us, what do you mean by that? Can you give an example?
Well, let's start with NATO. We're routinely called out by NATO for not meeting our 2%. And the words out of our Prime Minister when thought he was off camera were that we will never meet our 2%. I put it to you that we have come very close in the past and that we are now moving further and further away from it. Rhetoric is not investment. When this government came to power back in 2015, they talked about a total re-expansion in national security with new equipment, new training, new capabilities, none of which has been realized. So rhetoric versus reality is a real show. And so what we need to be seeing is a government which actually believes that Canada is a country that should play on the world stage. So with NATO, we've seen our NATO allies constantly call us out. In fact, Barack Obama, back when he addressed the legislature, when he said we need more Canada, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals interpreted that to mean we needed more of Canada's socialism. That was not what, if you go back to that actual statement, what he was saying is Barack Obama was trying to say we need Canada to step up and meet our 2% commitment to NATO. We've seen ABCA, the American, British, Canadian, Australian partnership. New Zealand is also in the ABCA, simply turn away from Canada and not even invite us to many of the recent discussions. We've seen intelligence agencies not include Canada in discussions about what's going on with some of the counterterrorism activities because they feel Canada's the weakest link and will either share or simply allow to be disclosed very, very secret information, which is critical to the national interests of their country. So we've seen our largest trading partner, the U.S., turn its back on us. We've seen our NATO alliance, and the NATO has always said trade and security go together hand in hand. In fact, that's what the United States told us. I briefed Paul Cellucci right after September 11th here in Alberta. He was the American ambassador to Canada. And Alberta had built a counterterrorism crisis management process to protect our critical infrastructure that he was extremely interested in. But when he arrived in my operations center, the first words out of his mouth, looking me straight in the eye, he said, "David, security trumps trade. If you can't prove to me that the Alberta supply of oil and gas is secure, then you are not a reliable trading partner. By the end of the 2 hours I had spent with him, both classified and unclassified, he walked away and demanded that I be allowed to present our process to Congress and the Senate in the United States, because he was so clearly understanding that we took security in Alberta even more seriously than he had in the United States.
Wow.
Where can you hear that statement made today from our NATO partners, our ABC8 partners, even partners who are outside on bilateral agreements? They think Canada's the weakest link. They do not think Canada's a leader.
Wow. Well, your summary of kind of the state of the nation in 2024 is pretty humbling. I look at this also from the long point of view, that Canada was not simply built over one generation. It was built over many generations in terms of hard work and courage, people working together. No one's perfect, but this country is an incredible country. And it seems to me that what you're describing is almost like taking an asset, a gift that has been nurtured over time and built up, and it's being systematically run down. Is that what's going on?
In my opinion, that's exactly what's going on. It's intentional and it's conscious, the division that's been brought into our culture. Now, I talk about the words culture and ethics and values almost interchangeably. And so I want to make sure it's clear. A nation defines itself based on its values and ethics. Now, that can produce a culture, but let's use Switzerland as an example. If you look at Switzerland, there's three very distinct cultures. In fact, there's more than three in Switzerland. There's the Italian, the German, and the French cultures, which have been come together. But what unifies a country like Switzerland is its ethics and its values, which are common amongst all the people that call themselves Swiss. That's what Canada used to stand for, and I believe, to a large degree, still stands for. People come to Canada, our recent immigrants and the refugees coming to Canada, look to the Canada that they knew, that they thought Canada still was. One that believed in democratic rights and freedoms, that believed in individual responsibility, and that believed in the individual right to own property. When they arrive here, they're seeing a Canada that isn't what they thought they were coming to. When they see diaspora marching in our streets, when they see the Eritreans fighting amongst themselves and raising money for a foreign war, when they see Sikhs looking for freedom of a part of India, a democratic country that should be our ally, but which we have pushed so hard against that now they don't even want to talk to us. And when we see what's going on with Hamas and the people marching in the streets in our country supporting a terrorist organization, which is an illegal act with no arrests, with no responsibility or accountability for people that are screaming for genocide, then the recent immigrants who came to Canada to try and escape exactly that, the ethics and values of terrorist countries and dictatorships, and they're seeing it unfold on our streets, they're wondering why they came to Canada.
Well, I think that's very well said, David. And one of the things that strikes me about your points is that if we talk about national culture, that is not by accident. That is consciously nurtured and taught to the next generation. It's intentional. Culture, like in any great family or a community or a nation, needs to be intentional. And that's a reflection of leadership. And I'm wondering, one of the things I want to share with you and our audience is a clip from the current Prime Minister who talks about Canada being kind of a post-nation state. And I want to share that now.
When Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says his country is a post-national state and has no core identity, no one should be surprised when some start asking if Canada is even a country. But the identity crisis facing Canada is not only multifaceted, it's serious and could one day have a direct impact on the United States. Canada is in the midst of, as one writer put it, a civilizational experiment that's transforming a Western nation into a post-Western nation. And this revolution is centered around the cult of diversity.
Your Canada.
Here's one version of Justin Trudeau's post-national, post-Western Canada, transformed by diversity.
Oh, Canada, you stand for everybody.
The question is not whether Canada should welcome immigrants. The question, according to Toronto Sun columnist and SiriusXM Canada host Anthony Furey, is whose values should win the day.
In Canada right now, it's labeled bizarrely xenophobic and anti-immigrant, and they throw around terms like racism to no end. If you simply say, I'd like us all to integrate here and live together in a compatible way.
Throughout their histories, both Canada and America have welcomed immigrants of all backgrounds. But Canada, rather than being a melting pot like the U.S., has said that it is a mosaic of many cultures. The problem begins when the Canadian mosaic includes more and more radical Islamists who favor undemocratic values under Sharia law. Prime Minister Trudeau welcomed almost 50,000 refugees from the Middle East in 2016 alone, and has even welcomed returning ISIS fighters, saying in an interview that they could be a powerful voice.
And a lot of people, probably the silent majority, are saying, I'm unhappy with this, including new immigrants who came to Canada, whether it's a year ago or a decade or 3 decades ago, who say, no, I came to Canada for a reason, because I wanted Canadian values and I was escaping values in other countries.
One immigrant who would like more Canadian values is pro-Western Muslim Tahir Gora, founder of Tag TV in Toronto, a network with a large international audience. He's also a co-author of Submission, The Danger of Political Islam to Canada, with a warning to America.
I moved to this beautiful country because of its Canadian culture. People like me escaped Pakistan or Middle East or the Muslim world, came to Canada, and some went to United States with the hope that they will be left alone by those radical Islamists. But now we see those Islamists roaming around in this part of the world.
Tariq Fatah is a journalist, writer, and founder of the Muslim Canadian Congress. An immigrant from Pakistan and a proud Canadian, Fatah says the Canadian left, which in his words is sinking in white guilt, now accepts and even celebrates undemocratic radical Islamic beliefs and practices. He likens it to a circus.
It considers radical Islam as a phenomena that needs to be embraced because it is so curious. So we as Muslims are considered as circus animals. We need to perform in a way. And the white left liberal feminist class would sit in ringside seats and say, how lovely. Just look at that monkey jump up and down. Or that elephant stood up on his 2 feet. Honey, did you see that? Oh, it's breathtaking.
Another facet of Canada's identity crisis can be seen in the growing trend of what are called land acknowledgements.
We want to begin by acknowledging the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on which Wilfrid Laurier University's campuses sit.
Land acknowledgements are recited daily on campuses and in schools across Canada, and they essentially declare that Canada is an occupier.
We respectfully acknowledge the territory
in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the island of Newfoundland,
as the ancestral homelands
of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk.
These continue even though a poll this year found that most Canadians do not believe Native peoples should have a special status and that the government should stop apologizing for past wrongs. The culture that is under fire here is traditional Canadian Christian culture. Ottawa resident Alexandra Belair grew up behind the Iron Curtain in communist Czechoslovakia, and she sees some disturbing parallels between life under communism and life in politically correct Canada.
What do you say to someone who says, that's preposterous, I can say whatever I want in Canada? How can you compare it to the Soviet world?
But you can't say anything you want. Because I was a daughter of a political dissident, teachers would take the time to berate me and say bad things about me in front of the whole classroom, because that way they were proving they weren't showing favoritism to the dissident's daughter, right? Now my friend's daughter was in school and she was being shamed for being too Christian. How's that different? How is that different? She was being shamed for feeling very patriotic Canadian. How is that different for being shamed for being a dissident's daughter?
There's a saying here that the world needs more Canada. But if current trends continue, the world is going to get less of Canada, as Canadian identity is swallowed up in a left-wing multicultural experiment. Dale heard CBN News in Toronto and Ottawa.
So that's quite a clip there. There's a lot of issues, but the theme seems to be that Canada is going into the so-called uncharted territory as a nation of being a post-national nation, whatever that means. So does that make sense? Is that kind of your point that you're making, David?
So there's so much to unpack in that clip. But let's start with post-national state. The WEF, the World Economic Forum, loves the concept of a post-national state. So let's talk about what they mean by a post-national state. What they mean is that they, a very small group of elites, are in charge, and that they can make rules which are then binding on nations. So the elected officials of a nation no longer represent the people of their nation because the World Economic Forum will decide what's best for all nations. Let me take you back a little bit in history to World War II. Everybody says that World War II, like World War I before it, perhaps was a war born out of rampant nationalism. I put it to you that number one, it wasn't. But number two, if it was, the only reason why the democracies of the West exist in the form they do today is because of the nationalism of a small island country called Great Britain. Winston Churchill stood up and said no in 1940 to Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, and said, no, our nation will stand and will resist your nation's will to be imposed upon us. Without the nation of Great Britain, if they had surrendered, democracy today would look completely different if it existed at all in the entire Western world. That nationalism saved democracy. So the whole concept of a post-national state, a nation cannot act on the world stage, number one, unless it is a strong and vibrant nation in itself. And the people of a country elect people in a democracy to represent them, not to follow the bidding of an unelected group, whether it's the World Economic Forum, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's any organization that wishes to impose its will on our nation. Our nation is a democracy. A democracy represents the majority, the will of the people of that nation, and that nation then clearly needs to define its culture, defend its culture in its defined region, and then establish the 6 national interests which it will then bring to the world stage to make the world a safer and more humane place. So the whole idea of a post-national state, as I describe in the paper, flies in the face of all logic. It simply is a way of destroying democracy, in my opinion. And I, as a Canadian, strongly believe in democracy and want nothing to do with a world where our nation doesn't stand as a nation and is simply at the whim and will of forces outside of our country which don't represent the people of Canada. Now,
but that sounds like you're making a very powerful argument, David, that you can't have a nation if you aren't clear about your national interests, your purpose, your vision. And if you quote stand, and somebody says this in kind of an airy way, if you stand for everything, you don't stand for anything at all. And I think this is reflection of the leadership that we have today. And I'm wondering if part of this is just either, I don't know if it's incompetence or a lack of awareness of the nation that we live in and its nature and its history. But I do want to share with you another clip where here we have the Prime Minister expressing his admiration for the Communist Party of China.
Justin Trudeau's popularity in the polls is a problem for the Conservatives, and they'll take any chance they get to knock it down. But Trudeau has a way of giving them those chances. Trudeau's meeting last week with a group of Toronto women was an example. Even with Sun TV watching for any slip, he was asked which country he most admired and referred to China.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say we need to go green as fast as we need to start investing in solar. I mean, there is a flexibility that I know Stephen Harper must dream about of having a dictatorship that he could do everything he wanted that I find quite interesting.
Trudeau's rivals pounced on that, saying it proves he admires dictatorship.
His answer demonstrates again a long-standing position of our party that he is in over his head.
I found it a bit silly for Justin Trudeau to say that what he admired the most was a dictatorship, frankly. I've always been rather fond of democracies.
And it wasn't just politicians who condemned Trudeau's comments.
A Canadian politician said, I look for China. I'm admire of the basic dictatorship in China. That is not only shocking, that is a shame.
So there you have it. I think that's one indicator of many that you have a leadership in mind that have a kind of a sense of policy that we don't really stand as a nation for our own interests, and we're confused that we would admire the Communist Party of China. Now, I understand there's some real strengths there, but it's not democratic. It's got a horrific record on human rights. So what does that clip tell you, David, about the kind of leadership we have in our country right now?
There's, again, so much to unpack in that clip. Justin Trudeau is carrying on the tradition of his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, whose three heroes were Mayo, Khrushchev, and Fidel Castro. He routinely talked about them. He routinely talked about communism. And he raised his son that way, and it's no surprise that his son would say something like that and, in fact, truly believe it. Justin Trudeau doesn't believe in socialism. I truly believe he believes in communism. But let's just go to the actual statement that he just made. He said he admires the government of China because as a dictatorship, so he's recognizing it's a dictatorship, it can turn on a dime to resolve green issues. Well, that's an out-and-out blatant lie. China introduces about the equivalent of 2 large coal-fired electrical generating plants a week.
Indeed.
They are the worst polluters on the planet. There is no intention on ever reining them in, and they've made it very clear that till 2050, i.e. after they have destroyed Western democracies, they intend to do nothing on the climate file. So his statement is, in fact, false. It is a dictatorship that could turn on a dime if it wanted to, but it definitely doesn't want to on the climate issue. What it has turned on a dime is total repression of the Uyghurs. It has total citizen control of in all of its cities, towns, and villages. It has tripled the size of its military in the past decade. It's built a blue water navy. It's expanding dangerously into the South China Sea and threatening places like the Philippines, Japan, and all of the surrounding countries of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. So, yes, a dictatorship can do exactly what it wants, ignoring the will of its own people. That is not what Canada is or should be. And yet we're seeing China allowed to build police stations in Canada to directly influence our elections in Canada. So what Justin Trudeau said in his statement, he is not backing off on. He's actually making it become reality in our own country.
Wow. So, David, I think well said. And again, I marvel at the whole point that if you stand for everything and you kind of drift within the winds in order to pursue short-term political gain, then we are truly vulnerable to all kinds of negative influence from foreign actors like the Communist Party of China. And it's well documented, has significant influence across every area and institution of our society now. And that's why that inquiry is being undertaken. We'll see if it gets anywhere in terms of really getting down to the root issues of Chinese influence in our country.
So Chinese influence is, in my opinion, one of the largest dangers to our country, but it doesn't stand alone. there are other foreign entities at work in our country. And our intelligence agencies, CSIS, all of the border services and our policing are recognizing some of the activities that are occurring in our country. And I'm forced to ask the question, why are they not either allowed to get the information out to the Canadian public in the case of CSIS and DES and others like that? And why are our allies not able to get their information through our agencies out to us? We know that political leadership in our country was briefed on many of these issues and that they simply did not share the information with Canadians or actually dismissed it as not important. And we've seen the direct influence on the last two elections, perhaps more. And so the question is why? Why is this government not interested in doing that? But I want to back up and go higher again. I believe that, as Anthony Furey said, a vast majority in the clip, a vast majority of Canadians are wondering why and when we are going to take our country seriously again. When are we going to define a Canada for 2050 that isn't based on post-national issues and isn't based on social and minor divisive issues, but is actually defined by the 6 national interests of our country and unity being the number one issue? Because as pointed out by Anthony Furey and other people in that clip, people come to Canada looking to escape totalitarian governments, looking to escape the cultures and values that hold women in disregard, that hold individual rights and freedoms in disregard, that destroy property rights. They come to Canada to get those things, and yet we seem to be in a period of time in our country where those very issues are being dismissed. And that breaks up unity, but it breaks up all 6 of our national interests. And the question is it intentional? We need politicians that step back, define what they mean for Canada in 2050 on all 6 of our national interests, not just on minor sub-bullets under 1 or 2 of them. And so we need a 25-year vision for our country where Canada thrives in 2025, but thrives through all 6 of the national interests, which they must clearly define. Because if Canadians see how a politician defines all 6 national interests and they don't like it, then they have the right not to vote for them. But when each of those actions are taken one at a time on small issues with no definition of the overarching aim, it's clear that it's done without Canadians' best interests at heart.
Right on. So your point is we can't do this by accident. We can't just fall into the ditch here in terms of making our national purpose and national interests by accident. This needs to be conscious. This needs to be discussed publicly in a transparent fashion. So one of the things on that note, you created this paper, you go through and define those points of national interest, David. And you've outlined already the key first national interest, which is about unity. You also talk about national Canadian security. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so national security, it is made up of many elements. And everyone wants to run right down into national defense. So let's, once again, go back up. National security is the cornerstone for defined borders. So you have a culture within a defined set of borders, an area which you intend to protect the people who share those common ethics and values. And so the first step is actual border security. So organizations like CBSA, organizations like the Canadian Coast Guard. So you actually need to define your borders and defend them. The next step down is then deciding you've already got a group of people within your country, which you're working on the first one to bring unity to. So the next step is you don't bring people into your country who don't share your ethics and values, because now you've created an internal problem from an external source. So under national security, the second step is to define external threats and then to take actions to ensure those external threats don't come to your country. Therefore, you need an immigration policy that matches your ethics and values and matches the other 6, the full 6 national interests. But that first and foremost defends your unity and your defined borders. So in immigration policy, you then need to go to internal threats, and you need to look at all the different issues of both national hazards and human-induced hazards within a country, and then establish organizations like your emergency management organizations, your policing, all your first responder group, to be able to handle your internal security problems. And then once again, national security looks at the global issues to try and increase international stability. And stability is not allowing people who wish to break up other countries who share your ethics and values, and to provide clear actions on the part of the citizens of Canada to support those who share your ethics and values, and to try and mitigate actions taken by those who do not share your ethics and values. So national security has many elements. I break them all out in the paper, but it starts with defined borders, then it goes to external threats, internal threats, and then how you wish to be defined as a player in the international community for stability operations.
So to be clear then, within the field of immigration, using that as an example, David, it's important that we have immigration. It's a question of how we manage it. And immigration should not just be having an open door to anybody. How do you do those kinds of value tests to ensure that we're getting people who are going to integrate into Canada and share and support our unified values?
You start off by ensuring that people who express an interest to come. Okay, let's talk about legal and illegal. Illegal immigrants should be immediately returned, regardless of whether or not they share our ethics and values. And the reason I say that, and I'm talking about immigrants, not refugees, but they need to be returned because the people who follow the legal process are the people that we wish to have in our country, because right away, by defining they've arrived illegally, they've broken one of our basic ethics and values. Return to sender. Now you've got a legal system, and you're not jeopardizing the number of legal applicants by permitting illegals to take their spot. Legal applicants then clearly have to show, if they wish to become Canadians, come to Canada and become Canadians, they need to show and be able to demonstrate that they share our ethics and values. And that's not an evil thing. All the other countries in the world do it. Let me give you probably one of the worst case scenarios of how other countries do it. If you look at the border fence between Hamas and Egypt, you will see very clearly that the Egyptians will not let the people of the Gaza Strip, the Hamas supporting 83% citizens of the Gaza Strip, to cross into Egypt. Why? Because Egypt knows that its unity would be put at risk if they allowed the people from the Gaza Strip to come to Egypt. So people that actually have the same religion, the same defined ethics and values, you would think, will not allow Gazans to come into Egypt. And there's a very clear reason why. Because they believe they would be a threat to their unity. So if that type of government can do it, and does it routinely, and the international world organization says, okay, Canada, step up, take more because Egypt won't take them, then my answer immediately is no. Canada has an immigration system. We take people who share our ethics and values. And one of our ethics and values is very clearly the equality of women. And so we want to attract people to our country who believe in the equality of women. That just being one of our ethics and values. But Canada needs to define that and base its immigration policy on, number one, can we house them? Number two, can we employ them? Number three, do they speak one of our two official languages, or show they clearly have the potential to learn very quickly and become a contributing member of society? So we need to bring them with our cultures and our values, and with a need. Canada needs to define what its needs are, not just a flow of anybody and everyone who come into areas of employment that are already overflowing, or who come into areas where they will never have employment. So we need to define an immigration policy based on our ethics and values, based on our unity, and then based as well on the other 5 national interests, national security being one of them. People who come who don't share our ethics and values, who we now see our Minister of National Defense trying to get into the Armed Forces of Canada, who may in fact be nothing more than people who ultimately will turn on the country that they are now trying to become a part of, makes absolutely no sense. So you need to define your immigration policy based on all 6 national interests, but unity and national security coming first.
David, in this case, I think that immigration is really kind of an elephant in the room now, as we have a record number of immigrants streaming into our country. It's stunning, the number. I think if you include all temporary visas, we're approaching some 2 million a year. So the numbers are horrendous. All those parties do get health cards. They're looking for a place to live, understandably, when in fact we have in most Canadian cities a massive affordability issue for housing. It's almost like our middle class is being destroyed. So in this context, I'm wondering, though, if there's some assumption that we're making here that is incorrect, and that is that you're assuming that you have a federal government in charge that believes in managing immigration with the assumption that borders matter. In other words, there's a whole network of parties now, a lot of these come out of our universities, who don't believe that national borders are appropriate. And you hear this in the latest agreement under the United Nations that says that there should be no borders, that there should be a free flow of people. So we have a very radical assumption going on, I think, within our federal policy now that our borders really shouldn't matter and we should just let in millions of people. And that's exactly what they're doing.
I agree that that's exactly what they're doing. And I also agree that it is undoubtedly being done intentionally because people like the World Economic Forum and others, the United Nations and some of the organizations within the United Nations, believe that the way to destroy democracy is to destroy the unity of the democracies and to put in place a system where a very small group of elites make decisions for nations worldwide. So I need to come back to the very first thing I say in the paper. What do Canadians want? If Canadians don't want to be Canadians, if they no longer wish Canada to be a country, then we simply need to follow the path we're on. If we do want Canada to be a country, and in my opinion, 80% of Canadians still strongly believe in Canada as a country, which has rights and freedoms, which believes that equality does not equal equity, that believe that our country is a place where you should be able to raise a family, own individual property, and that your children's future will be better than yours, then I believe we deserve politicians who express a 25-year vision, what their party intends to bring to Canada in 25 years, and defines it in a very transparent and complete definition of the 6 national interests of our country. So perhaps we need to get to all 6 of those and show the audience what we're talking about, and that Canadians deserve political leadership that represents them, not that represents the World Economic Forum, not that represents the United Nations, not that represents others. And so if you look at the 6 that are on your screen, we need leaders, whether they're in political stripes or whether they're in people out within our society, who can openly and transparency define all 6 of those. What do they mean by unity? What do they mean by national security? What do they mean by good governance? And I'm going to come back to good governance in a minute because I wrote my paper for a democracy, not a dictatorship. What do they mean by rights and freedoms? If they wish to represent to the people of Canada, they need to define exactly what they mean by that and how they're going to defend it. What do they mean by economic prosperity growth? And I break that all out in the paper as well, the different types of industry, the different areas that we need to focus on, and personal and community well-being. The concept that people are basically responsible for their own health and wellness, and that when there is something that overwhelms them, that the state should be able to step in, but not until they've exhausted their own ability. And community well-being, we're seeing a rise in child abuse. We're seeing a rise in disparity between groups within our society. Our communities are breaking down. So we need politicians and leaders of all stripes to fully define transparently what they mean by all 6 of those. And I want to come back to good governance. Good governance, in my definition, is very clearly for a democracy. So it's how are our elections run? How do elected officials, whether they're municipal, provincial, territorial, or federal, act and act transparently and responsibly? How do all of our democratic institutions work? Our courts, our papers, our media, our policing, all of our border services. How do our good governance principles work? And how are they defined by the leader? Because what we've seen is a complete breakdown of good governance in our country. We had a prime minister who in January, the pandemic had not even been declared, tried to dissolve the federal government of Canada. He tried to dissolve it before the pandemic was even displayed and asked for powers to make spending for the next 18 months without the interference of the MPs who were elected to represent our country. The intention was clear and obvious. We need good governance defined, transparently for all Canadians so they understand who and what they're electing.
Okay. You know, what strikes me about that list, David, and again, I encourage our audience to look and read that paper, is that list of 6 national interests are really key questions, as you're saying, to ask every candidate during elections and even now to speak up and ask about them. Because what it seems to me is a fascinating dynamic in society where we have, usually if you look at public opinion, some 20-25% of Canadians would be determined as very woke, as kind of very hyper politically correct, if you will. It seems like that's the government that we have in power now, at least at the federal level, from a policy point of view. So they're taking all this list of 6 national interests that you've eloquently outlined more from a traditional lens, and they're flipping it upside down systematically. So instead of talking about national security, they're undermining national security. Instead of talking about unity of values, they're talking about diversity and making people into their respective tribes. So it's almost like we have an upside down government that is pushing policies which most Canadians would actually not even recognize. Is that a fair comment?
It's an absolutely fair comment. I believe that what our citizenry is seeing today is each of those 6 national interests eroded or intentionally attacked. Let's talk about rights and freedoms. And let's talk about the woke culture, the cancel culture, the whatever you want. The 1967 I grew up in, I don't want people to go back and say, oh, it was a golden time. It definitely was not. The Vietnam War was raging. 67, it was in full swing. It took until 75 to ultimately come to an end. There was protests in the streets in the United States of America. There was protests in the streets in Canada. By 1970, our universities had woken up and there was large groups on campus. A lot of draft dodgers had come to Canada, and there was a huge debate in our universities about the Vietnam War. Let me make it very clear. There was a huge debate. 2 things that are completely different from today. Number 1, both sides were allowed to say their piece, and both sides were allowed to protest and to represent the democratic right of protest by marches, by conversations, by holding town halls, by making grand speeches. So, number 1, democracy reigned in terms of the rights and freedoms being permitted. Freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of discussion. On the other side, the universities never took a position. It was not the job of the chancellor of a university to say, I support Hamas. I support the Viet Cong. No, the university permitted the discussion to happen in its halls. It didn't take a side, and it allowed that discussion to happen. What we're seeing today is exactly the opposite. our institutions, and not just our universities, but all of our institutions and our educational facilities, are picking sides and are canceling, removing professors that disagree with the stated opinion of the university. They're removing students who don't reflect the values, quote unquote values, which are clearly democratic values, are being thrown out of the university. So I want to underline the fact that all 6 of those national interests, the rights and freedoms being one that must be clearly defined, and I always thought, since the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was written, and which had the Oakes test to verify before any freedom could be removed, I thought it had been defined in our country. It clearly has been thrown away or is being intentionally disregarded throughout our culture right now that allows it. And let me go back, David, you said you don't think most Canadians, I strongly agree with you. I don't believe most Canadians believe in what's happening. And I've talked about it before, but I believe that from my military background and working in large units up to 1,100 soldiers and civilians, that 5% of people are evil. That they just were brought up wrong or have genetic deficiencies, or they just don't believe in the ethical, cultural, and values of Canada. They and never will. I believe that 80% of citizens in Canada are good, are strong, like to go to work, believe in self-responsibility, want to go to work every day and make a better living for their family, want to ultimately own a house. What all of those things that people wanted in generations gone by. There's 15% I haven't defined. 5% evil, 80% basically good. The 15% slide either way. If they don't see the 5% being dealt with on a daily basis by our police, by our courts, by our elected officials, by our administrators in universities, if they see that 5% getting away with what I define as evil, but what is illegal or inappropriate, unethical or illegal acts in our society, if they're getting away with it, the 15% slide with them. In the Army, we called that a unit with poor morale. When leadership did not do their job and did not handle and manage that 5%, a battalion with 20% doing inappropriate actions was a battalion with bad morale. What happened to the 80%? Did they suddenly become evil? No. They put their heads down. They went silent. They came to work every day. They did their job, and they got on with their life and just waited for a real leader to reemerge. When a new leader arrived in a battalion or in a brigade or in a division, then suddenly that new leader could turn around that 5%. And all it took was making an example out of an illegal or an unethical act on a number of individuals, and very quickly the 15% slid back to the 80%, the morale went up, and the organization functioned on all cylinders. Now, the 5% will never go away. They constantly have to be dealt with. And I don't mean by throwing them in jail. They simply need to be, justice must not just be done, it must be seen to be done. And that dissuades others from doing the same acts those did. So, in my opinion, Canadians are waiting. The 80% of Canadians are waiting for true leadership. There's only one danger. Stalin came along in Russia, Lenin and Stalin, and they took a country and turned it into a communist dictatorship from another type of dictatorship. And that's why I never support revolution. You never ultimately end up with what you think you're going to get. But when the wall came down, there was an opportunity for a new form of government to emerge. And what I'm seeing in Canada is Canadians are waiting and waiting and waiting for the end of this slow cultural breakdown of the 6 national interests of our country, hoping that it can be turned around in time for them to be reestablished. Now, you can always reestablish it. The question is how long does it take? And so if we see this continue on this path for another decade, it will take at least double that time to turn it around. It will not be fast. It's going to take whoever decides to change the way our government is run, backed by defining 6 strong national interests. If we want Canada to be thriving in 25 years, the first 10 are simply going to be rebuilding, trying to get back to where we were.
Yeah. But let's be frank, David, when we look at this type of discussion, we're talking about the foundations of our society, our great country, Canada. And I think as I talk with Canadians, one of the things that I've learned is that there's a number of insights that they bring to the table. One of them is that they know that something is amiss, something is awry in this country. It's not in a normal period of time. There's a lack of affordability. There's a lack of kind of a bright optimism that people had growing up. There's a sense that the future of their children is in doubt. And the other thing I learned from Canadians time and time again is that there's a sense that somehow we have a window. We don't have forever. We have a number of years to turn this country around and to get it back on track, to be able to rebuild, renew our institutions, to clarify our purpose, our national interests, as you so eloquently put, David. But we don't have forever. And therefore, I ask you the question, what do we do as citizens today to start getting our country back on track?
So the faster we reestablish a vision for our country and reestablish a clearly defined and transparent set of 6 national interests, the faster we can make Canada thrive, not survive. And so what do citizens do? They demand every single MP, every single MLA or MPP, and every council councilperson or mayor or reeve define exactly what they believe their community will look like in 20-25 years and how they intend to achieve it. What do they stand for? And they should define what they stand for very clearly and transparently based on those 6 national interests. Now, if you're talking about a municipality, then they're municipal interests. If you're talking about a province or a territory, then they're provincial or territorial interests. And if you're talking about our great nation and the leadership of a party that wants to lead Canada, then it's national interests. And then they need to very clearly define how they will do it. And so once you define transparently your 6 national interests, that's the first step. And in the paper, I break down the next steps and how to bring it forward in terms of objectives and performance indicators so the citizens can see that you put your money where your mouth was. You didn't say one thing and then do exactly the opposite. But there has to be that set of 6 benchmarks pulled apart and defined for the citizens so they know what they're voting for and they know what they're not getting or what they are getting, which leads me to my second point. Once you have leadership that defines a vision and their interests, then there must be a way to remove elected officials that is in a fair and balanced manner when they do not do what they said they would do when they were elected. So we need recall legislation for every order of government that allows an appropriate number of citizens to bring forward a recall vote. And it has to be able to be done in a realistic manner. I don't believe in recall votes being triggered for every single MP every 5 or 10 friggin' weeks. It's got to be an achievable standard, but a hard standard based on the fact that it's clearly provable that the individual did not do what they promised to do when they were elected, and what they promised to do should be defined on a very clear vision based on ethics and values with 6 defined national interest type of bullets broken out so people can see what they stand for.
All right, I like what you've outlined, David, because in many ways, it's a litmus test that citizens can use in conversations with their elected officials as they not only interact with them directly, but also listen through the media. And I'll give you one example. So if there's elected officials that are not talking about a vision for our country, they're not talking about our national interests, they're not talking about a plan to move this country forward, but instead it's all about vilification and demonization of their political opponent, then that is a surefire sign, David, is it not, that they're not interested in the future of our country or the future of our children.
Anyone who uses fear, anyone who looks to break up unity should not be a leader within our country. So if that's what they're doing, then I totally agree with you that they have just clearly defined themselves as not what I would believe to be a responsible, ethical, trustworthy political leader for our country. And it happens at every order of government. It happens within our institutions. It happens within the democratic institutions that we defined, our border services, our immigration services, our policing, our courts, our media, and all the other areas that are laid out very clearly in the paper. When you see people acting not in the public interest as defined by a democracy or by the existing ethics and laws, and I emphasize laws of our country, when we see intentionally people being allowed to break the laws of our country, then that's the lack of the will of our political leadership and all those other institutions. And the leadership within each of those institutions must be held accountable.
So well said, Lieutenant Colonel David Redman. Thank you for joining us for this conversation and indeed for your challenge to each and every one of us as citizens to think more about our national interests and the vision for our country. Thank you for joining us today and for your insight and your courage for talking about this important issue.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.